I'm Donald Yacovone. I spent a good almost 7 years working with Henry Louis Gates Jr. at Harvard. And teaching White Supremacy is my 9th book. So I've been at this a long time, and I don't have any plans to stop. So, and I do appreciate your interest in the work. I think it's important. I think it's essential for understanding our current social crisis, but that's my view.
Well, after reading the book, I tend to agree with you. So, as you said, we're talking about your book, Teaching White Supremacy, America's Democratic Ordeal and the Forging of Our National Identity. And I first came to attention of this book because you have a very kind of novel approach to delving into the subject matter of white supremacy, and that's looking at textbooks.
Yeah.
Can you tell us why and how you came to these textbooks?
This is a fascinating, for me, it's a fascinating story. And I think it's an important one to understand because authors are often attacked for their supposed political views, and that their motivations for writing a particular work have more to do with politics than history. And indeed, that does occasionally happen. But in this case, I think it's important to explain the background so that individuals who are perhaps interested in getting a hold of the book understand where I come from, and how I came about doing this. It was, in fact, sort of a mistake. It was was not intended. I didn't set out to write this book. I hadn't even thought about doing a book of this nature. And indeed, I started the project, and this is important, before the election of Trump. He wasn't even nominated when I started this. So I didn't really have any political, quote unquote, political motivations for doing this. What happened was I was doing the research for a book on the memory, public memory of the anti-slavery movement, and that public memory's influence on the creation of the second and our modern civil rights movement. And I had spent a good several months going through the papers of John J. Chapman at the Houghton Library here at Harvard, 55 boxes of his papers. And when I finished, I thought I could use a break, because I have an enormous load of manuscripts to go through, particularly for the papers of the Garrison family, who were very active long after the death of the famous William Lloyd Garrison. And I thought, well, before I really dive into up to my neck in tens of thousands of documents, I thought, well, I'll take a break. I'll go over to the Gutman Library here at Harvard, which is in the Graduate School of Education. And I'll take a look at a couple of textbooks to see what they said about the anti-slavery movement and their reputation. Now, of course, I knew the historiography of abolitionism. I mean, that's my first book was a biography of Samuel Joseph May, who was a prominent abolitionist. And but I had never really even thought to look at textbooks and what they had to say. I mean, I think from a researcher's point of view, textbooks are just summaries of what people have already done. So what's what's the big deal, right? Yeah. So I went over there, and I was physically confronted with over 3,000 history textbooks stretching from 1800 to the 1980s. now I wasn't, I wasn't prepared to see this. I wasn't prepared. I was stunned. And I thought, well, golly, what am I gonna do? So, and these textbooks, 3,000 of them were in these electronically movable shelving units that were very large. They were about 7 feet tall, and they must have been, Jesus, 20 feet long. I mean, they were just enormous. And so you have a sense of being belittled, physically belittled by this huge collection, right? So I thought, well, what am I going to do? Well, I'll pull out the volume that, and they were chronologically arranged, which was fabulous, as it turns out. Okay, I'll pull out the one for 1832, which was the year after Garrison started the Liberator. I thought, well, that's a good place to start. We'll see what they have to say. Well, of course, they hadn't say anything. And it just turned out to be a book by Noah Webster. I mean, he's famous for creating the dictionary, the American dictionary. And he didn't have anything to say about the anti-slavery movement. In fact, and he had almost nothing to say about the South. For him, the history of the United States was the history of his Puritan ancestors, and his Puritan ancestors in Connecticut, no less. So it was a very restrained, restricted, and specialized work. And I thought, well, that's odd. So I just kept going through year after year. And it became so obvious to me what the themes of these books were. I wasn't looking for anything other than what they had to say about the anti-slavery movement and about slavery. And it turns out they didn't say an awful lot. Some of them were critical, but they didn't say anything about people of African descent. Slavery was just an institution that they discussed in the most general term possible, without very many specifics, if they mentioned it at all. And as it turns out, books that came out, these textbooks that came out during the 1830s that were critical of slavery, eliminated all that criticism in the 1840s. So I got hooked. I got, well, this is really fascinating. I didn't expect this. And so I just kept going. I kept looking. I kept reading. And suddenly, it was in many ways, and I've described, people have asked me, and I haven't come up with anything better in the 2 years since it's come out. It was like a force descended over me and said, Donald, you have to give up the book you're writing because there's something really important going on here. And this has never happened to me before. And as I said, I didn't set out to do this. It was completely accidental, but the force of the messages of these books, and they got more and more intense in terms of their emphasis on whiteness, the later we get in time. And in fact, by the early 20th century, they are becoming so overwhelmingly, directly, inescapably emphasizing whiteness that the reality just was inescapable. I would be lying if I had done anything else. And so after finishing the collection and sort of taking a breather, I thought, well, nobody wants to read a book about a bunch of bad books. I have to figure out why this happened. Why was the history of the United States that was being presented to readers, and these are mostly school-age kids, okay, from grammar school right through to college, why are they being inundated with this frame of mind? What caused it? Thus, the first two chapters of the book to explain that. So this book ended up not being a book about a bunch of bad books, as I say in the intro, but rather a study of American identity, how Americans have conceived of themselves, and what better way to look at this question than to look at textbooks, because it's a kind of open diary from 1800 to the present of how America's, because when you write a textbook, few people write textbooks to condemn the country they're writing about, okay? They're usually there to explain the essence of that country. That's the point of them. It's history, what they've done, and how they think of themselves and how they think of their own future. So what better way to get at the way Americans had conceived of themselves than through textbooks? It turned out completely accidental, but absolutely inescapable.
Well, yeah, and I think that's, as a librarian, I can tell you, we designed those shelves that you wandered into on purpose for that sense of awe, just so you know.
Well, you succeeded.
So anyway, getting back to the textbooks themselves, and you touched on this right at the end. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how these textbooks functioned not only within the public educational sphere, but also as a master narrative for a political consensus, as it says in the book.
Right.
And then that can lead us into, I think, the white supremacy piece, because that seems to be the master narrative that you discovered, correct?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the point of these. I mean, it's not really complicated. I mean, there was a master narrative, and the master narrative is very clearly aimed at particular group. They make it very clear by the images that they use in the textbooks, and by the language they use, and the people they are addressing. And all of this is made inescapably clear. There just isn't, I didn't have to do any guesswork here. There was no guessing about who the audience was for this, because the audience was American youth for the most part. And I supplement the textbooks with hundreds of other related books that, in many cases, the sources that authors use to create the textbooks, but certainly to create the frame of mind, because these authors are, I mean, they're so openly clear. It's almost embarrassing. Well, it is embarrassing. An example is one 1930 textbook that stated on the very first page, in capital letters, the history of the white man, or the story of the white man. I mean, yeah, you have to be either blind or a lunatic not to understand what the point is. And the other books didn't have to be so obvious, because that was the assumption that it was very clear. And often, in particular, when an author would usually at the beginning of a book would kind of set the background, they would include images of the kinds of people they were writing for. And of course, they're all little white European kids, nobody else, absolutely nobody else. And it was to glorify the rise of democratic values and who those democratic values were for. And these books make it abundantly clear.
Yes, and I mean, the evidence is overwhelming in your book. I would like for you to talk about before the Civil War first, and then we'll get into after the Civil War. So what did you find about the founding of America, the origin of slavery, British role, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, there's a model that almost all the books follow before this, actually, particularly before, but even after, and that is European exploration, European colonization, the revolution, the establishment of the government, and then every successive presidential administration, one after the other. That's the way history was conceived. There was no such thing as social history. There was no desire, there was no thought given to addressing social history, intellectual history, the audience who might be diverse. No, this was the model. And oh, and by the way, every paragraph had a number. Every single paragraph. I remember I was astonished that there was one book, I think it was textbook that was published, I think in the late 1870s or early 1880s at the Gutman Library. And it was clear that students weren't always attracted to these books because someone had stabbed the thing through the back cover and halfway through the book. But I mean, this was the model before the Civil War. Now, as we interestingly, as I said early on, some of the early textbooks did have criticisms of slavery, even of the slave trade, although Northerners made fortunes dominating the slave trade. And they made even more money after the abolition of slavery, of the slave trade, the importation of slaves in 1808, because they were delivering slaves to the Caribbean, where it was not outlawed. So there is some of this, but as we get into the 1840s, as the nation's politics are heating up, okay, this isn't revealed in the textbooks. This is the context that an historian brings to understanding the context of these books and what's going on. That particularly after some of the early slave revolts, there's fear, and indeed in many of these books before the Civil War, the authors are honest and direct about the fear they're confronting. In fact, they won't even talk about some things for fear of inciting even more animosity. So after, and particularly after 1830, 1831, with the rise of William Lloyd Garrison, after the slave revolt in Nat Turner slave revolt in Virginia, and national politics at that time is divided between the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, with slavery as a central issue. So the nation is here. Now, you don't get that from the textbooks. You get that from understanding the history of the nation. Textbooks aren't dealing with this. In fact, they're deliberately avoiding it. And the further you get into American history, particularly after the 1850 Compromise, which was so devastatingly controversial and conflict-ridden, the books are deliberately not addressing these issues out of fear of inciting even more controversy during this period. So the worse the politics gets, the more the books that I'm looking at are avoiding examining these things and are only emphasizing positive things like economic development. Yeah. Until you get to the Civil War, and then suddenly you can't avoid it anymore, folks. Yeah.
Well, and there's an interesting ramp up of kind of explicit and overt white supremacy right before the Civil War and through the Civil War and then after. So let's sidestep the textbooks for a minute and
Sure.
talk more about the white supremacy that's going to come to kind of just seep through these pages.
Yeah, well, what became, like I said, after I had done this, the study of the textbooks, I had to figure out why that was. And of course, as it turns out, that wasn't real hard to do because the evidence is so overwhelming and so abundant. I mean, when you get people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, who Americans think of as liberals and sort of left-leaning, and you realize how much they abhorred African Americans, it becomes it's not difficult to show because it's everywhere. Whether you're talking about literature, you're talking about religion, you're talking about law, certainly, medicine, you name a subject matter, geography, you name a subject matter, and it is dominated with white supremacy and Black inferiority. It's everywhere. And it's inescapable. And when someone like Walt Whitman is so disgustingly overt in his disdain for African Americans, you understand what's going on.
Yeah, and maybe you could talk a little bit about a gentleman who you wrote a whole chapter about,
Yeah.
which is this Van Every character and
Yeah,
who he was, and just kind of briefly give an overview.
Yeah, well, John H. Van Every, I liked. It became so obvious to me once I started reading his books. Now, older historians had made occasional references to him. George Frederickson, many years ago, in his book on race in America. This was back in the late 1970s, I think, mentioned Van Every. And I remember reading it. In fact, I read his book to do mine. But his discussion of Van Every wasn't very long. And in that context, he was just like one more racist. So what, right? But while I was in the library, here's another one of these library revelations. While I was in the library looking for another book, his book on slavery, one of his last books, I think came out in 1861, was sitting on the shelf like 5 books down. I thought, oh, Van Every. I remember reading about him in George Frederickson's books. And I read it out, and boy, was that a revelation. And so I dug deep. Now, there had never been a biography of him. There still isn't a biography of him. A colleague, Michael Woods, is working on one now, but there's never been a biography of him. And so here was an opportunity for me to delve into someone who turns out to be absolutely essential to understanding how American race attitudes formed and how they were disseminated across the nation, even into Europe, and how much he influenced Southern views of race. And this is a central point of the book, that it isn't as everyone had assumed, that the advocates of Jim Crow after the Civil War and in the South are responsible for the worst attitudes of our country regarding African Americans. As it turns out, when you look at the important people and issues and subjects, it's Northerners in every single case, whether it's Van Every in journalism, whether it's Walt Whitman in poetry. You take a subject, Northerners are the ones who are forming national opinions. And as it turns out, Van Every had an enormous impact on the advocates of what we've been calling the lost cause ideology after the Civil War. And they read Van Every. In fact, one of them, Mildred Lewis Rutherford, reprinted his books. So it isn't, we can't fluff off our racial problems on, an ancient slave past in the South, or, the advocates of Jim Crow after the death of slavery. In fact, it's a national problem, not a regional problem. Certainly if you're talking about law, it was Massachusetts people who wrote Plessy versus Ferguson. So, Van Every then becomes a kind of standard, a kind of symbol for Northern influence on attitudes regarding race throughout the nation. And indeed, even in Europe, Europeans recognized him as an authority in race, an idea that he didn't even agree existed. And we can talk about that in a few moments if you like. But he really is a symbol representing Northern influence on the shaping of race attitudes in America, not just the North, not just the South.
Yeah, and I'd really like to, without getting into great detail, just kind of outline his major philosophical approach to race and how he defined what would come to be the ideology of lost cause and some of these other white supremacists.
Well, what is so surprising from a novice's viewpoint, what is so surprising about Van Every is that he's a radical defender. I mean, a truly radical defender of labor. And of course, he is what we would call an avowed racist, something he didn't even believe in. And excuse me. Astonishingly, he argued, particularly in the latter 1850s, where his approach began to more sophisticated, argued that slavery didn't even exist in the United States, that there were no slaves. And the reason why he did this is he read all the great theoreticians on human development and species development, like Louis Agassiz at Harvard, okay, who was renowned for helping to form American race attitudes. Josiah Clark Knott, Samuel Morton, these people who wrote about human development, what we would today probably refer to as genetic development, only their attitudes were based on speculations. They didn't have the science that we had today. And of course, races don't exist. They're a figment of the 18th century imagination, and developed over time, and particularly by people like Louis Agassiz. Okay, but in the case of Van Every, he argued that slavery was an institution that white people used used against other white people. It was a white institution. It didn't refer to people of African descent, because people of African descent were, to Van Every's thinking, based on these folks that he had read, that they were a lower form of human. Yes, they were human, but they were completely different, what we would consider completely genetic line of humanity. And the way he argues is, just as there are different species of birds, there are different species of humans, with people of European descent at the very top and people of African descent at the very bottom, who were more like animals rather than humans. And this is the way he he developed his theories about how to treat people of African descent. To his thinking, they were a people designed by God and nature, and he referred to both God and nature, to serve the white man. That was their role. And oddly, you would expect someone like this, if you read his books, to be filled with hate and anger. It's not. Because the way he saw people of African descent, they were like cows or horses or mules. Who hates cows, horses, and mules, right? That was his thinking, was that God and nature determined that these people were of a certain nature, they were of a certain construct, and they were designed by God and nature to serve white men, to do their work. There's nothing wrong with that, he said. It doesn't make them inferior. It makes them inferior compared to whites, but they had a well-defined role. And to his mind, they were essential. In fact, he used the analogy of two boys on a seesaw. They were there. They were essential for the development of America. Many Northerners were colonizationists. They wanted their answer to the problem of race in America was to expel people of African descent and send them to Liberia, what eventually became Liberia. Van Every said, no, we don't want, if we got rid of all African Americans, we would soon quickly learn that we need them. And we would import them again and replace those we'd gotten rid of. No, they are essential, and they are a balance, just like two boys on a seesaw. And without them, boom, you fall off. And you know, that determined his politics as well, and the way he approached the Civil War. He thought the Civil War was a gross mistake based on all these misapprehensions of about the nature of African Americans. To his mind, it was, we don't have to have this war. You know, it's simple. These people are here to do our work. That's all. And he got a lot of popularity for a couple of reasons. One, because he was so supportive of labor and so against elites, because to his mind, America, the American colonies and then early America developed democratic values because of the presence of African Americans, because it showed people of European descent that the differences among them were slight. Because look at people of African descent. Now you can see how different they are from you. So you needn't fear democracy, because you have to remember that when the colonies were formed in the 17th century, democracy was feared. Democracy, these were elite institutions. These were class-riven European countries. Democracy was not valued. Democracy was feared. In fact, even when Americans formed the Constitution, one of the major fears in developing the Constitution was of excess of democracy. And today, you might see Trump as a symbol of what that fear meant to people in the 18th century. So in any event, so to his mind, the African presence was a blessing. It showed people that they needn't fear democracy, in fact, could build on democracy, but democracy was something only for people of European descent.
Yeah,
and I should go. I won't go on too much longer. But what's so important, I think, is the degree to which Van Every disseminated his ideas across the United States and in Europe. He was so imaginative. He was so dedicated. And as I say in the book, I mean, frankly, if you read it, any newspaper, particularly one that supported Democrats, you saw either an advertisement for one of his books or something that he had written. I mean, in 1 year, he had placed, and this is from him, he had placed advertisements in over 1,400 American newspapers 1 year. So people became exposed to him, and even Europeans reviewed his work. So so it became so obvious to me after when I was doing this research and collecting this information that, oh my God, here's someone that no one's ever heard of who was essential in helping to create the attitudes we are dealing with today. Bing.
Yeah, and it's such an as I was about to say, that like it's just so hideous
Yeah.
in that it's so effective for white people to hear, right? I mean, it plays on all those superiority complexes and we're all equal kind of thing in our whiteness.
Yeah, and as I've found out in the last 2 years, a lot of so-called white people don't want to hear
That's true.
it. Yeah.
So as we move past the war, you noticed a real shift in how the textbooks started to deal with what you kind of pinpoint out 5 issues. And it starts with slavery, and that goes into abolitionists, John Brown, Civil War as a source and conflict, especially the presence of Black troops, freed slaves, as combatants, and then how Reconstruction is portrayed. And specifically, the abolitionists and Reconstruction,
No.
from the Northern perspective, really surprised me.
Yeah.
How the tables turned on those two.
Yeah. Well, I certainly did. You know what, when I was thinking about how to craft this book near the beginning, I thought of it at first as a kind of textbook battle, right? But as it turns out, there wasn't much of a fight. What we do see, though, and it's perfectly understandable. In fact, it would be surprising if it didn't happen, is that immediately after the Civil War, from the 1870s to about 1890, okay, you have a number of textbooks coming out that are attempting to express the desires of the goals of Reconstruction, to recreate, to sort of rebirth, a rebirth of the nation. And some modern historians now are calling it the second founding. And I think that's a really convenient way to understand what is attempted during Reconstruction. And there's a number of textbooks follow that course. Charles Carlton Coffin, for instance, who was the most well-read, most read, and I think most popular Northern Civil War reporter. He wrote a series of textbooks which essentially tried to capture this notion of a rebirth of America having destroyed slavery. And so you get Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a very well-known minister and abolitionist before the Civil War, who became head of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers during the Civil War, a Black unit. He published a textbook. So you get this attempt to capture the essence of Reconstruction and to reframe the understanding of American history and its purpose and its goals briefly. But by the time, Reconstruction, despite what some modern historians are arguing, it's mostly dead by 1876. And there's no greater evidence for the repudiation of the second founding than what you see going on in these textbooks. And oddly enough, very often you get people writing textbooks who've got nothing good to say about slavery at first. But when it gets to Reconstruction, the horror sets in. And there isn't a textbook published from about 1911 until about 1970 or so that didn't portray Reconstruction as a disaster that placed people who were not capable of running anything in positions of power, which is to say, people of African descent. It was a cataclysmic response to the attempt to create what we would call racial equality in the United States. It was ugly, it was vicious, and it made heroes of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, and the Klan's involvement, as with other ex-Confederate organizations, mainly the Daughters of the Confederacy,
Sure.
really started to kind of influence, not only to pick up this banner of the lost cause, but also to influence this Reconstruction as further Northern aggression, carpetbaggers who are using the freed people as weapons against other white people.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is just this narrative forms that we can't seem to shake completely, can we?
Yeah, no, it's a horrifying change. And again, mostly based on the work of Northerners, not Southerners. One of the most influential people to help change attitudes was James Shepherd Pike from Maine. Now, that's pretty north as far as I'm concerned. And his analysis of Reconstruction in South Carolina was devastating. Now, he claimed he was a journalist. In fact, before Reconstruction, he was an important Republican. He was an aggressive abolitionist, and early on, he even supported Black rights for the Civil War. He became a diplomat during the Lincoln administration, but then after the close of the Civil War, I think what happened is the reality of the end of slavery and what was going to happen to people of African descent hit him. And it hit him in a way that scared the daylights out of him. Because even before he went to South Carolina, he was damning and denouncing Reconstruction in South Carolina. And then he went to South Carolina, and of course, only talked to those people who sustained his already present attitudes. And he wrote this book on the history of Reconstruction in South Carolina, which was a devastating critique depicting people of African descent as stupid, incapable, incompetent thieves and liars who dominated the government of South Carolina. And this was the model for Reconstruction. This is the way Northerners began to see it was a complete lie, but it was his way to prevent the rise of people of African descent and to defeat Reconstruction, which he had previously at first supported and then threw his entire weight upon. And his book was read everywhere. And indeed, I found it quoted in later textbooks, even though they didn't give an identity to where the stuff they were quoting came from. But I recognized it because it was a direct quote. It was inescapable. So again, Northerners helping to define how to perceive people of African descent, how to perceive the history of Reconstruction, and the importance of the Klan was just now as an historian, I knew this. This was no surprise, but to see it on a day-to-day basis and to see it in textbooks was really quite shocking. And it was everywhere. And and the further we get into the 20th century, the more devastating these critiques became. It is, and again, it isn't until 1963 that we have the first textbook that repudiates all this and begins to change attitudes in the North, but it's a very long process, in some ways extending to this day. Yeah.
So as a kind of a wrapping up the North, as far as why this attitude changed, do you think it was because, I mean, I think we can both agree it was probably fundamentally white supremacy, right?
Yeah, sure.
And there's a fear of a pluralistic, multiracial democracy
Right.
that is driving this. But why do you think the abolitionists of the North made this turn, or did they, or why someone could support anti-slavery, but then so much fear of pluralistic multiracial?
Yeah, well, we have to understand that the anti-slavery movement wasn't a unity. There was anything but unity. Abolitionism. I read all the when I was doing my book, my first book, my dissertation on Sam May. I read all the reports of all the abolitionist conventions in the North. And I have to tell you, they spent more time fighting each other than they did the South. You know, they all had the idea that there was an ideology, and there was only, and if you had a particular ideology, it had to be correct. And everything had to fit into that hole. And if something didn't fit, then it had to be wrong. And so, you know, so people emphasized voting. Other people emphasized not voting, emphasized politics, emphasized anti-politics, emphasized the role, excuse me, the role of the Constitution in forming democratic values, or the role of the Constitution in forming anti-democratic. There was nothing but debate, and sometimes, you know, pretty angry debate over the nature of what slavery meant and how to defeat it. And for many people, slavery, particularly in the North, slavery was an abstract institution, since well, slavery wasn't abolished in New York until 1827, and there were slaves in Connecticut. There were slaves in Rhode Island. Well, Rhode Island had been the seat of the slave trade, right? But there wasn't much contact with people of African descent. So it was everything in terms of the North's attitude toward abolitionism, however that was defined, was in a way speculative, because it wasn't based on for the most part, on first-person experience with the institution. So by the time you get to Reconstruction, you know, the death of Lincoln and then Reconstruction, the lack of unity before the Civil War continues afterwards in many ways, although the issues are different. So you could have been like, say, Daniel Webster. Well, you know, Daniel Webster didn't support slavery theoretically, but he certainly supported compromise that sustained slavery. There were plenty of other politicians and authors who didn't necessarily like the institution of slavery, but they had no contact with people of African descent. Almost none. And so they could hate slavery and hate people of African descent, and there's no contradiction. And that indeed is exactly what happened. The radical Garrisonians who supported what we call equalitarianism were a very distinct minority. Yeah.
Right. And we can also see, jumping ahead in the timeline, what happens during the Great Migration as far as the North's attitude toward integration alone is, a whole other book. But so if we're kind of wrapping it up here, if you had to pull out one or two major, like these textbooks informed and taught generations of children, what would you say the overriding message of the myth that these textbooks create for white America?
Could you repeat that? I'm not quite.
Yeah, I think what I'm getting at is that the textbooks themselves were used to teach so many white children. What was the overriding myth of America that they taught to these white children, given your kind of purview of them?
Yeah. Well, the overriding, I think by the time we get into the 20th century, certainly, there is large-scale agreement on the necessity to end the institution of slavery. There is not much dissent, I mean, to that. There are different emphases. Once you get into the 20th century, Southern presses begin to publish textbooks that they had not before. Okay, so you get a very happy, satisfied, utopian view of the institution of slavery, completely devoid of reality, right? But an age in which people who were Black and people who were white got along because people who were white were in charge and everything was happy and blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. What you find for the most part, however, I think in most textbooks, and again, most textbooks are published in the North, right? But Chicago, New York, and Boston are the ones that dominate the trade. And they make it clear, I think, to the American public, certainly by the 20th, into the 20th century, that slavery was an unfortunate institution and we are better off for not having it. But because of the way they depicted Reconstruction, they also made it abundantly clear, and in many ways, very direct and very obvious, that people of African descent were not, quote unquote, ready for the kind of civilization that white people naturally and inherently enjoy, and that they needed more education, more training, more discipline, more control by people who are white, so that they could eventually adopt attitudes now, that are acceptable. However, the further we get into the 20th century, the less tolerant most Americans are. No matter how tolerant they might have been, no matter how progressive people of African descent might actually be, in fact, they're never going to be able to incorporate them into the mindset of these people because, again, the attitudes of the 19th century are continued and re-emphasized in the 20th century about the superiority of people of European descent and the inferiority of people of African descent, which is completely because of science, because of economics, because of religion. There's nothing you can do about it except control them. And that becomes an unwaveringly firm theme in almost all the textbooks, certainly in the 1940s, certainly in the 1950s, and for most of the 1960s. It's just, it drips. Yeah.
And it'll be interesting in 100 years for someone to sit down with the textbooks that we have today.
Yeah.
And how we deal with the civil rights movement of the 60s and the Reagan, everything that's come.
Yeah. Well, the problem now is that, and I touch on this in the epilogue of the book. We're in the case where textbooks no longer have the dominance that they did earlier. And that is for several reasons. One, people don't use textbooks as much as they did. Trying to get national statistics are difficult, but what I've seen is it could be as many as a third of people who are teaching history or what we call social studies to the lower grades through high school don't even use textbooks anymore. Now, sometimes that's good because of the wonders of the internet, like what we're experiencing. You can access documents and sources that you could never have accessed earlier. I mean, and therefore it makes a textbook sort of, in many ways, unnecessary, because you can go right to the sources and have the students read them. And that's really terrific, I think, in many ways. Also, unfortunately, for the same reason, books that were published in the 1930s or even in the 19th century are also available. John H. Van Every's stuff is available. And what is becoming abundantly clear is that people who are taking their children out of school and homeschooling them, they're using these other sources to teach them. So the 19th century is coming back to haunt us in terms of homeschooling. So it's a difficult, because of economics, because of technology, trying to do this kind of study for in the future, or the future looking back at this period, would be much more difficult because of the disparities in the way schools now work. And what I discovered, particularly when I was lecturing around the country about this project, this is sad. Libraries are throwing out books. They're getting rid of the books. Librarians don't even run libraries anymore. Information specialists run libraries. I'm sure you're not an example of that, but it's certainly in colleges and universities, this is going on. In fact, I was told when I was speaking at a New Stockton University in southern New Jersey, they backed up a dumpster in the back of the library and filled it with books. Professor happened to be walking by. He saw one of his own books on top of the pile. This is horrifying. So there you go.
Well, yes, and it is, yeah, I wonder about the scholarship of the future, because so much is digital, and
yeah,
what we're producing isn't even necessarily, savable, because it's digital. And if that website disappears, then that whole,
yeah.
so it's for people in the future to struggle with, I suppose, but.
Right.
Well, thank you for this work and thank you for your time. And are you working on anything currently?
Yes, I'm putting together a collection of essays. I have about 15 authors on lost and forgotten African Americans. And the book is intended to show that African Americans have been essential to the development of American culture. They're not, African American history isn't an add-on, it's not a supplement, it is history. And so these are all people who had quite literally traced the path from the slave cabin to the White House, quite literally. And you know, we're looking at people in the arts, in literature, in science and medicine. I mean, just all aspects. You know, I think that if things go well, within a year that the book should be out. Yeah.